This conference will now be recorded.
In yesterday's session, we were discussing about what is pod and how to deploy the pod and how to access the pod we were trying to discuss. In yesterday's session, we deployed one pod basically in our Kubernetes cluster. If you see, I am connecting to my machine where I have a kubectl configured. Using kubectl, I am trying to communicate with API server. In fact, I configured kubectl in this machine. This machine is basically a master machine which is part of the control plane. As I already discussed yesterday, if required, can we configure kubectl in a different machine, and can we access, can we communicate with Kubernetes cluster to deploy, update, delete application from a different machine which is not part of Kubernetes cluster? Yes, we can do that. Now, from this machine, I am able to talk to the cluster, and if you see, in the current default namespace, I don't have anything. In this namespace, test namespace, how many pods are running? How many pods are running as of now? 2 pods. If you see, this pod, what is this IP? This is the pod IP. This is the pod IP of this one. Within this pod, what we have? Within this pod, we have a container. How many containers as of now? It's a single container pod. It's a single container pod. Now, this pod is running in this node. Now, what about this one? This pod is running in different node. Now, as I already discussed, within my Kubernetes cluster, let's say one application, one microservice, basically one pod, let's say. Let's say this is my Kubernetes cluster. Now, within this Kubernetes cluster, let's say one application is running as pod and another application also running as pod. Now, how one pod can communicate with another pod? As I already discussed, right? This is one pod. Let's say this is one application. Inside this pod, we have a container. This application is running inside this container. Inside that pod, we have that application running. Let's say this is one pod. So we created a pod like this. And this pod has one container, one application is running. This is our application. This is running inside this pod. Now let's say one more application is running, maybe in same machine, different machine, but part of the cluster. That can be in same node or different node, but part of the same cluster. One more application, one more pod is running with this container. Now, as I already discussed, does each pod has its own IP? So this is the IP address of that pod. So this is the IP address of this pod, and this is the IP address of other pod. This is the IP address of other pod. Now, Inside this pod, on which port this container is running, what is the container port of this one and what is the container port of this one, both are Tomcat containers. So within this pod, the container is running on this port. Within this pod, the container is running on this port. As I already discussed, does one pod can communicate with other pod using pod IP also? Like this application want to access this application. Can they use pod IPs like this? Inside the code, can they use pod IP and container and whatever application context it has to use something like this? It will work. It will work within the cluster. It will work. Now, if you see, this is running in different machine. This is running in different machine in 227. This is running in another machine. If required, let me go inside that pod. I'm going inside this pod. Test namespaces, something like this, bash. Now I'm inside this pod. If you see, am I able to reach this pod on that port and my application context? Which means, does one application, one microservice deployed in Kubernetes cluster as a pod can communicate with another application, another microservice, which is also running as a pod in the cluster using pod IP in the same cluster? If you see, is it working? Yes. But as I told, what is the problem? What is the problem with pod IP? Let's say this pod is deleted and recreated. Do you have a guarantee that you will get the same IP for that pod? No. If this IP is changed, again, the developer who is writing the code here, does he need to modify this port again and apply? Yes. So instead of this, how we can access the application, how we can access the pod, whether within the cluster, outside the cluster, we have a concept of service. We have a concept of service. Yesterday we discussed already. So, as I already told, service makes pod accessible within the cluster or outside the cluster. So service makes pod accessible or discoverable within the cluster or outside the cluster. So there are different types of services. What are the types of services we have? Cluster IP service, node port service, load balancer service, and headless service. Like this, we have services. So we'll understand what is what one after the other slowly. Now, service, cluster IP service. If I create a service of type cluster IP, as I already told yesterday, if I create a service of type cluster IP, what will happen? It will expose the service, I mean to say it will expose the service on a cluster IP, cluster internal IP. If I create a service of type cluster IP, it is reachable within the cluster. This is the default type. When I create a service, we will get one more IP address, virtual IP address, that we call it as a cluster IP. When I create a service like this, we are getting one more IP. What is this IP? Is it your pod IP? Is it your node IP? No. This is your service IP. We call it as a cluster IP. With this IP, right? This IP will be registered in the DNS, Kubernetes DNS. We have already DNS running, Kube DNS or Core DNS within the cluster. Yes. So this IP will be registered with the name, whatever name we are going to use for that service. Then, if other application, let's say other pod, can they use this service name Instead of using pod IPs, other pod, other application, can it use service name, whatever service we created for these pods? Does other pod can use that service name for accessing other pods? Yes. So service is a logical concept. Service is a logical concept, as I already told. The real work is done by whom in the background? The kube proxy. The kube proxy. Kube proxy. Now, when this application is using service, does it redirect service to pods? When we are using service name, the kube proxy which is running, will it redirect from service to pods? Will it redirect from cluster IP, that is service IP, to pod IP when the other application is using service? Yes. Now, how service will identify pods? We have a lot of pods in the Kubernetes cluster, right? You can have a lot of pods in the Kubernetes cluster. How service will identify which pods belongs to that service? What concept service is using? Service is using labels and selectors concept. Labels and selectors concept. If you remember, when I created a pod yesterday, did I add these labels for this pod? Let's say something like this. App, Maven, web app, something like this. Did I add labels like this for this pod? Yes. So when I'm creating a service in my Kubernetes cluster, can I give selectors like this? App, Maven, web app, something like this. Can I give a selector like this when I'm creating a service? Now, this pod is different. This pod is different application. Suppose I have this pod has a different labels. This pod has a different labels. This pod has a different labels, let's say. Something like this I have, let's say, for this pod. Now, when I create a service with this selector, does this service will consider this pod as a backend for this service? Does this service will consider this pod as a backend or as an endpoint in the background for this service? No, it only considers this one. So I created a service with a name like this. Let's say Maven Web App SVC, just to give an example. This is my service name. This is my service selector. Now this pod, can they use this name instead of using any IP, even this cluster IP or service IP? Can it use this name, service name? Something like this? Yes. And while creating a service, are we going to do the mapping? Are we going to do the mapping, port mapping also? So while creating a service, I am doing some kind of a port mapping. Ports, port and a target port. Port and target port. So port, what is this port? On which port you want to listen your service? On which port you want to listen your service? So can I have it as a default port also, like port 80? Yes. Or if you don't want to have a default port 80, can you have like 8080 also if required? Yes. What is this target port? This target port is nothing but the container port. What is my container port? 8080. Now, if I use this service name like this, if I use the service name like this in this pod, and since service is created on port 8080, do I need to use that port 8080 also? When if I have to reach this service, since service is created on port 8080, I need to use port 8080. Let's say if service is created on port 80, is it mandatory to use like this 80? No. Even though you want to use, you can use. Even though you don't give, basically request goes to this service on which port? Default port 80. So do we have a service created or service listening on that port or service created on that port? Yes. So request goes to service. Request goes to service. Then does that service will forward the traffic to the pods, the matching pods based on these selectors and labels? Yes. So with the help of this service, can we achieve service discovery and load balancing within my Kubernetes cluster? Now, let's say instead of one pod, let's say I have two replicas for this application, two replicas for this application. Now, this service has how many endpoints? If I have two pods with same image, same labels, two. In that case, does this service will act as a load balancing also within the cluster? If this application is accessing, will it route the traffic sometime to this pod, sometime to other pod? So do we have a load balancing within Kubernetes cluster using this service concept? Service discovery, it will discover where exactly it is running. And also at the same time, will it do the load balancing if I have multiple endpoints for that service? Yes. Now yesterday, did I created a service also for that application? Did I created a service also for that application? If you see, we created a pod as well as service. Now while creating a service, did I give this selectors, whatever labels I have given for my pod here, did I give those as selectors while creating a service? If you see, yes. Then port mapping. Now using this service name, the application like this other application, can it access? Can it access the other application like this other pod we have running? We have one more pod, one more application. One more pod. This can access using this service. How to see only services? kubectl get svc. In the short form svc. In the short form svc. In the full form service. If you want to see only service. Short form svc. But why I don't see that service whatever I have created? By default again, this is pointing to which namespace? Default. Now, where is my service? In which namespace service is created? In test namespace. In test namespace. Now this is my service. But directly from the host, any application which is not running as a pod, any application which is not running as a pod, you are directly deployed some application in this server that we will never do. But just to give an example, any application which is directly running in this node, not as a pod, but if you are using Kubernetes, you will not deploy any application directly in that machine. Everything will be running as a pod only. But if any application running in directly in this VM, can they use these services names? Will it work directly from the host? If you see, will it work directly from the host? Yesterday also we discussed. With this, will it resolve? Will that host, that service name will resolve to IP directly from the server? No. But from the pod, within the pod, from the pod or within the pod, Ravi Kumar is saying, no, it's out of cluster. Guys, this is part of my cluster only. This node is part of my cluster only. Where I am executing this command is part of cluster only. This 95 is master machine. It's not out of cluster. I am saying this service name will be resolved directly from the server, from the host, No. This service name will not resolve from the host directly, which means any application you are deploying in this Kubernetes directly, not as a pod, will they able to use that service name? No. But as I already told, are you going to deploy any application in the Kubernetes cluster not as a pod directly on the machine? No. But from this pod or within the pod or from this pod or any other pod, does this service name will work? Will this name will result to IP? Yes. So just to take an example, can I go inside this pod and check whether this application can reach this application using this service name? Yes, let me do that. I am going inside that pod. Now here, that service name and my application context or API context. One more slash is there. One more slash is there. That's why this one. Do you see? Is it resolved to IP, service IP? Then is that service is forwarding the traffic to pod? Is that service is traffic? This is resolved to this IP. Request is going to service. Request is going to service. That service is it forwarding the traffic to the pod, whatever is having as a backend for that service? Yes. As of now, let me come out of this. As of now, how many backends are there for that service? How many endpoints are there for that service? If I want to see those details, how can I see? I want to see more details about this service. How can I see? How can I see more details? Wide will give some details. It is giving additionally what is the selector. What is the selector for that service? kubectl get pods -n test -show -labels. I can see the labels of my pod like this. Now, service is created with this selector. Service is created with this selector. Now, pods, I am seeing the pods and labels also using this option -show labels. Now, this service is created with this selector. As of now, how many pods have labels? Whatever I have used here as a selector, how many pods I have as of now? Whatever I used under selector here, with that, how many pods I have? 1. Now, if I want to see more details, not only like this, what other command I can use? kubectl describe. What I want to describe? If required, can I describe a pod? If required, can I describe a service? Whatever I want to describe. Yes. If I want to describe service, I will say service in the full form, service, or in the short form, can I say SVC? Describe service, my service name. Why I am getting like this service not found? Namespace. In which namespace I have this? Test. Now, if you see how many endpoints I have for this service, under this service, I can see how many endpoints? 1. So, what is this IP? Let me get pods wide. So, I am getting pods using one more option called wide. So, whatever IP you see here under this service endpoint, that IP is basically, do you see, is it pod IP of this one? This one. But why this is not considering as an endpoint for this service? This IP, this pod. Why it is not considering this IP for this endpoint? Label is different. Even though label is different, even though I give the correct label, Do you think is it correct? Because this is different application. You are running different application in this one. Even though I give a correct, even though I give that label, is this application is running in this part, whatever application you are expected? No. So this is different application. That's why I have given a different labels. Now just to make it simple, intentionally, I am modifying the service selector. Intentionally, I am modifying the service selector. Let's say here, instead of Maven web app, let's say, I have given instead of app, name Maven web app. Here, this is key, this is value, but I am using different key and different value. Key is different, but value is matching. Will it consider this pod now? Will it consider this pod as an endpoint now? Let me apply this change. Let me apply this change. Let me apply this change. Now service I updated. Now when I describe this service, why I don't have any endpoint? Why I don't have any endpoint? Just to troubleshoot. See the labels of the pod. See the labels of the pod and get the service like this. Get svc-o wide. Now the service selector name equals to Maven web app. So do we have any pod with that label here? Name equals to Maven web app, something like that. Do we have any pod with that label? No. Now, when we use this IP or service name, will you get a response now? Something like this you are using, let's say. Will you get a response now? From other application also. Let me go inside other application. From here, are you getting any response back from that service? This time? No. Why? What is the problem? Does that service have any endpoints? Does that service has any endpoints, backends? No. So why that service doesn't have any endpoint? Because of wrong selectors. Wrong selectors. Guys, just to give only endpoints, you can use this command also. Get EP. Get EP. What is EP stands for? What is EP stands for? Endpoint. So when I execute like this, is it returning only that service name and endpoints for that service, whatever endpoints we have for that service name and endpoint. As of now, do you have any endpoints for this service? We don't have. Now, how to fix this problem? How to fix this problem now? How can I fix this problem? How to fix this problem now? We need to change. What you need to change? You can change anything. You can change either labels of the pod. You can change either labels of the pod. You can either change labels of the pod like name equals to Maven web app, or can I change the service selector? Either you can change the label of the pod or either you can change the service selector, whatever it is. Now let me change the service selector. Let me change the service selector. Now here, instead of name, I am giving app. Key is matching. Let's say I am giving something like this. Is value is going to match again? If I give something like this, key is matching. Will value will match again if I give something like this? No. So do I need to make sure both are matching? Key as well as value? Yes. Let me update YML. I just updated YML. Does it mean it will update in your Kubernetes? No. Again, do I need to make changes? Something like this. Now request went to Kubernetes. Kubernetes has recreated as per that change. Now if I see the endpoints, can I see that pod endpoint again? This service has one endpoint. Now, if I am accessing from outside using that cluster IP, that service IP, I am getting the response. From inside one of the pod, when I am using service name, am I getting the response? Is everyone clear what is service? Why do we need service? And how service works in Kubernetes? Sometimes in the interview they'll ask. Sometimes in the interview they'll ask, what is Kubernetes service? Why do you need Kubernetes service? And sometimes they'll ask this way, what is the difference between Kubernetes service and Docker service? What is difference between Kubernetes service and Docker service? Anyone want to tell what is the difference between Kubernetes service and Docker service? We already discussed both Docker service and Kubernetes service. In Docker Swarm we created a service. In Kubernetes also we created a service. How different these two? This is also interview question. What is difference between Docker service and Kubernetes service? You know both. You should be able to explain now. You don't need answer from me because I already explained what is Docker service, what is Kubernetes service already. You should be able to explain. This is interview question. What is difference between Docker service and Kubernetes service? Come on, guys. There is no point discussing this much if you are not able to answer. If there is no point, I am discussing in depth like this if you are not able to answer. Why I am covering this much details in detail, taking 1 hour, 2 hours for small topics and explaining so that you can understand. If you are not able to understand, there is no point of discussing Docker for these many days, Kubernetes for these many days. Whatever, you know. So when it comes to Docker Swarm, we are creating a service. Each service is representing containers as well as network, both. When I am creating a service, I am creating a service using some image in the Docker Swarm. Using that image, I am deploying service. That service is basically group of one or more containers. With same service name itself, does other application can able to access that service? Is service is like, in Docker Swarm, is service is acting as a net, is it a container as well as network? Is it managing containers as well as network? Yes. So in Docker Swarm, service represents one or more containers. And if something goes wrong with container, service is going to recreate the container. At the same time, can we use that service name from other application to access that one? Excuse me. Yes. But when it comes to Kubernetes, Jansi is saying no. If you remember Jansi, we deployed Spring Boot application. How I deployed that Spring Boot application? Did I created a service for Spring application? Did I created a service for Mongo? Is this service is created using some image in Docker Swarm? And is it managing containers? That service is group of one or more containers. And this service want to access other application. Are we using this service name? Whatever service name we created for other application? Yes. So in Docker Swarm, service represents basically application as well as network, containers as well as network. But when it comes to Kubernetes, is both are is service is doing everything? Is service is deploying your application? Are we deploying your application using service in Kubernetes? Or are you just accessing that application using service in Kubernetes? Only accessing, only network. Service is only network in Kubernetes. If I want to deploy application in Kubernetes, what we are creating as of now? What we are creating as of now to deploy application? Pod. We are creating a pod. But are we going to directly create a pod? We will discuss later. We are not going to directly create a pod. We have problems with pod. We will discuss later. First, we need to understand what is pod. Now, I am able to access internally using that service name. But will I able to use this one externally outside of my Kubernetes cluster? Will I able to access using that service name or this cluster IP? Will I able to access that application outside the cluster using that service name like this? Or this IP, that IP, cluster IP? Will I able to use and access from outside like this? Outside the cluster. That can be from any other machine which is not part of your Kubernetes cluster. Outside the cluster, that can be any machine outside this Kubernetes cluster which is not part of your Kubernetes. Will I able to reach that service using service name or IP address of that service from outside to access this application? No. Will I able to directly access using pod IP also? No. Then how to access from outside? How to access from outside? There is a one more type of service in Kubernetes called node port. Node port service. As of now, I have created what type of service? Cluster IP. So if I want to access my application within the cluster, sometimes in the interview also they may ask this way, I don't want application to be accessed outside of my Kubernetes cluster. I want to access that application within my Kubernetes cluster. Then what type of service you have to create? What is the answer for that? You don't want to access that application outside the cluster. You want to access that application only inside the cluster. What type of service needs to be created? Cluster IP. Now, I want to access from outside now, outside cluster. There is a one more type of service called a node port service. There is one more type of service called a node port service. So what is this node port service? So this node port service exposes the service, that Kubernetes service, on each node IP, on each node IP at a static port, or we call it as a node port. This node port service exposes the Kubernetes service on each node at a static port, that node port. So, which means it is like a port mapping in the Docker or Docker Swarm. In the Docker or Docker Swarm, are you doing like this -p, host port and container port? In the Docker or Docker Swarm, are you doing like this host port and container port? Similarly, Similarly, in Kubernetes, node port service. So it will expose the service, that Kubernetes service, on each node IP. What is the meaning of each node IP? The node in the cluster, all the nodes in the cluster, on each node IP, it will expose on one static port. We call it as a node port. Now, from outside the cluster, if I created a node port service, can I use that node IP? I mean to say that server IP, and also whatever node port I used for that service. Can I, from outside my cluster, this is my Kubernetes cluster. From outside my Kubernetes cluster, can I use this server IP, the node IP? Node IP is nothing but server IP. And also, can I use that node port, whatever I used from outside? Then request goes to that node, that server, on that node port. Again, from that node port, does request goes to the service, that cluster, that service, whatever service you created. From that service, again, will it go to the pod? From outside, request goes to the server on that node port. Then it will forward the traffic to that service, cluster IP, again, within the cluster. Then pod. So we need to create a service of type using node port. Now you will be able to contact node port service from outside the cluster. From outside the cluster, using what? From outside the cluster, if I want to contact that Kubernetes service, node port service, what I need to use? Do I need to use node IP? Node IP is nothing but your server IP. And also, do I need to use that port, whatever node port I am using? Yes. So sometimes in the interview also they'll ask, what is node port range? What is node port range? What is node port range? In the interview also they'll ask, what is Kubernetes node port range? What is node port range in Kubernetes? This is 30,000 to 32,767. Within this range, node port will be allocated. Now, how to create a node port service? Now, same thing, everything is same. Can I change the type from cluster IP to node port? Can I change type from cluster IP to node port like this here? Everything same like this. Now, can I change type from cluster IP to node port like this? When I am using node port, we have a port, we have a target port. Additionally, we have one more port here. What is this node port? What is this additional port here? This is your service port. This is your target port. What is this port? One more port. On which port you are trying to expose that service to outside? On which node port you are trying to expose that service to outside? It is like you are doing -P, that host port, right? So this is that one. But in which range I have to use that node port, guys? Can I use anything? What Kubernetes is recommended? In which range I have to use that node port? Here. 30,000 to 32,767. Now, even though I don't give this node port, does Kubernetes will randomly allocate port in this range if I am creating a service of type node port? Is it mandatory to give this one while creating a service? No, it is not mandatory to give. Even though I don't give, does Kubernetes will allocate some port, whatever is available in this range? Yes, randomly it will allocate. Now, let me do that. Now I want to access outside. Now, without creating a node port service, if I am trying to use any server IP, like your Kubernetes server IP, I am using this server IP, Kubernetes server IP, and I am using that port, let's say container port like this. Will it work? Will it work? Will it work like this? No. It will not work like this. Even though you open this port 8080, it will not work like this. So do I need to create a service of type node port? Then do I need to use that node port and that IP? Yes. Now, do I need to create a one more service again? For outside, one more service, inside, one more different service? Do I need to again create a one more service to access outside? No, not required. Can I use this one itself? Can I change from cluster IP to node port, single service? Yes. Now, let me change that. Let me change that. Now, instead of cluster IP, guys, if I don't give what is the default type, service type, if I don't give anything, what is the default service type? Cluster IP. Now I want to create a node port. So can I say something like this? Is indentation correct? No. So this is my indentation. Now let me apply. Before applying, what type of service is this? Cluster IP. Now let me apply. Let me apply. Now if you see, what type of service is this now? Node port. And in my manifest file, in service manifest file, did I mention that node port, on which port that service has to be exposed on the node? No. So randomly, does Kubernetes has taken one port in that range? If you see, what is this one? What is this one? 30855. That is your node port. And what is this one? 80. Is it your container port or service port? Service port. So what is the target port for this service? What is the target port for this service? 88. Okay. Now, the moment I have done this node port service, if you see, in each and every node, is that port is listening now? What is that port 30? What is that 30855? Do you see? Is that port, whatever port, node port is created in the server, in that node, in each and every node, do you see that port is listening 30855, this one? Let me show that. netstat-tulnp. Now, if you see this one, this is your node port for that service. In the background, who is handling any request which goes to that 3085 on that server? Kubeproxy. So service is just a logical concept. Service is just a logical concept. In the background, who is doing the actual work? Who is receiving the request and who is forwarding the request to service or pods? The Kubeproxy. Now, this is my master node. This is my master node. In that node, is that port is listening now? That node port, whatever I got for that service? Yes. Similarly, in the other nodes also, in the other nodes in my cluster, in this node also, is that port is listening? Is that port is active in these nodes also? If I go and check? Yes. Let me go to other machine, like other worker machine, which is part of the cluster. Netstat is not there. Let me install in this machine. If you see, Here also, is that port is listening 30855, whatever node port we got for that service, which means, can I use any node now? Can I use any node in my cluster to access this one, to reach this service? Can I use any node? Whether can I use this node IP and that node port, or can I use this node IP and that node port, or can I use this node IP and that node port to access from outside? Can I use this one, master, or can I use this one or this one, node IP from outside that respective port to reach this service? Is it mandatory to use master IP, or is it mandatory to use this IP or this IP to access from outside now? From outside, can I use node IP? What is the meaning of node IP? Any server IP, this server, or this server, which is part of the cluster. Can I use that one? Can I use this one? This node IP from outside? Because in each and every node is that port is opened 30855. Can I use this IP with that port, node IP and node port? Or can I use this one, this IP and that port? Request goes to that one. Request goes to that server on that port. Then will the request will go to that Kubernetes service, this service on cluster IP again? Then will that service will forward the traffic to the respective pod? If I do like this from outside? Yes. Let me show that. Any IP. But I have some server which is not part of the cluster. Can I use this IP to access from outside? Can I use this server IP? Because this is not part of the cluster, right? So you can't do that. Now I'm accessing like this. But do I need to open the port? That is AWS concept, nothing to do with Kubernetes. Do I need to open this port? AWS concept, nothing to do with Kubernetes. I am using this server IP. I can open in that server security group. AWS concepts. Firewall needs to be opened. That node port 30855, I am opening for everyone. Now, once that is done, am I able to access that application from outside the cluster using that node IP and that node port? This is my application context. So if you see, am I getting response from that application, that pod? This is my pod name, this is my pod IP. I have customized my code from where I am getting a response. If you see, am I getting response from that pod? Can I access outside using this node port service? From outside using that server IP and that node port. Now, within the cluster, can we still use this service name? One more application want to access within the cluster. Within the cluster, one more application want to access. Can we still use this service name? Within the cluster, one pod has to access another pod. Let's say this pod, this application want to access this application. Can we still use this service name within the cluster? Even though service is type node port, that is again still accessible within the cluster. Let me show that. Now, using that service name, can I access within the cluster? Within the cluster, you no need to use server IPs. You no need to use pod IPs also. You no need to use server IPs. You no need to use pod IPs. Can we use service name within the cluster? Yes. From outside the cluster, can I use that node IP and node port by creating a node port service? Yes. Now, similarly, I want to access this application also. I want to access this application, other application. What needs to be done for this one also, guys? I want to access this application also. What needs to be done for this one also? How can I access this one from outside again? The other application, what needs to be done? First of all, did I created a service for that? Did I created a service for this application first of all? Do I have a service for that application first of all? No. Can I create a service for that application? For this application, the way I have created a service for this application, this pods, can I create a service for this application also? If I have a service, then if I have a service for that one, then can I access that application also inside or outside based on the service type you are creating for that? Yes. So let me do that. API version. API version. Guys, observe vcaps, API version vcaps, v1 kind service metadata. What is this metadata? Name. This is metadata for service. Can I have one more service with same name like this? I already have a service with this name. Can I create a one more service with same name in same namespace? No. So I'm giving different name, Java web app SVC, something like this. Namespace. Do I need to make sure wherever I have my pods, do I need to create a service also in the same namespace? Yes. Then spec. Here, can I create service of type node port like this? Selector. Here, if I give selector like this, is it going to route the traffic to whatever application, whatever pod you are expecting? If you are creating a selector like this, is it going to route the traffic to the pod for whatever you are expecting to route? Again, even though service is this, again, is it going to route the traffic to other pod, other application? If you have like this? Yes. So make sure you are giving a correct selectors. So something like this I am giving. Ports. Port 80. Target port 8080. Even though I don't give node port, is it mandatory give node port like this? No. But can I give like this? Already this node port is already used. Can I use the same node port for one more service like this? No. But if required, can I use whatever it is available, maybe like this? Maybe like this also I can give. Even though I don't give. So even though I don't give like this, Kubernetes will randomly allocate. Now let me apply that service. kubectl apply -f Java web app SVC. Now do I have this service? This service. Now can I use this service name to access this application internally? This application internally, can I use this service name? Yes. If I want to access that from outside, can I use that node IP and this node port 30921 port? Yes. But let me open that port in the security group again. Any port, any server. Can I access using master machine IP address? Can I access using any worker machine IP address irrespective in which node that pod is running? That doesn't matter. You can access using any server IP address. I am using that server IP. And what is the port? 30. 921. This is my application context. But do I need to open this port in the server where I am accessing? So I am trying to access from this server. This is my master server. In this server security group, I'll open. Whatever I am doing now here, is it anything to do with Kubernetes, guys? No, it is AWS concept. Firewall needs to be opened. Now, am I able to access that application? No, I am not able to access. How to troubleshoot? What could be the problem? What is the problem? What could be the problem? I am not able to access. What could be the problem? One problem, network. From my laptop, do I have a network to this one? Because that is public IP. That is public IP. So am I able to reach that server? You can use ping by opening ICMP protocol, or you can use curl with the telnet. Do I have a network with that server? Whatever server I am using. Let me do something like this. Maybe some port if 22 is opened. So do I have a network from my laptop to that server? Which means do I have a problem with network? No, there is no problem with the network. Now, let me use that port. Let me use that port 30921. Now, it is saying connection refused. It is saying connection refused. Firewall is opened. Request is going, but it is saying connection refused. It is not saying timeout. It is saying connection is refused. So what could be the problem now? Let me troubleshoot. Here, let me get the endpoints. Do I have any endpoint for this service? Do I have any endpoints for this service? No. Why? What could be the problem? What could be the problem? Let me see the service -o wide. So service is created using which selector, guys? Service is created using which selector? App, Java, web app. Now let's see the pods. Guys, if I want to see the pods, labels, can I use this option, -show labels, get pods with this option? Can I see the labels of my pod using this option? Yes. Now what is the label of this pod? What is the label I have here? Run equals to Java web app. So is this label matching with this selector? No. So that's why, does this service has any endpoint in the backend? No. Then how can I do this? How can I do this? Can I modify? How it got mismatched? I created that way. I created that way. So how I executed this one, if you remember yesterday, did I executed this one imperatively like this kubectl run command Java web app -image? Did I executed this command yesterday? Imperatively I created. I have not given any labels. I have not given any labels. So is it took this name, pod name as a value, pod name as a value, and this run command as a key? Because I have not given any labels. So is it created that way? I have not created using YML. So it created that way. Now can I modify the label of the pod, or can I modify the selector of my service? Anything. I can update the label of this pod. You can update imperatively also, guys. kubectl edit. kubectl edit. What I want to edit? Can I create, can I update this one imperatively also, this pod? Imperatively. I don't have a YML. If required, can I modify imperatively like this also? kubectl edit pod name, your namespace. Now it is showing like this. It is showing like this. Can I come and modify the label now here? Something like this. escape colon WQ. Now, is my pod is updated with that label? Imperatively, I am updating because do I have a YML for this one? Do I have a YML for this pod? Because yesterday, did I created this pod using declarative way? No. Imperatively, I created. So can I imperatively also edit? Instead of you updating YML and applying YML, can I imperatively also edit like this? Now I have updated my pod label. Now if you see, do I have a service for that? This one, let me see the endpoint, CP. So do I have an endpoint for this service also? Because your pod label is matching with your service selector. Now will I get a response? Will I get a response now? Yes. So service is very, very important, guys. You can understand why I am stretching this much time. I no need to explain all these things like this. I can just simply create a service like this, like the way you guys learn. The way you guys learn, I can also teach. Create a service like this, create a pod like this, access like this, it will work. But that doesn't help anywhere. You need to understand how it is working in the background, how it is working. Also very, very important. The concept is important. Is everyone clear what is service, how service will act, discover the pods and what is pod? So this is node port service, cluster IP service. Now, if this pod, this application want to access this application, can it use respective service? If this application want to access this application, can they use this service? This application want to access this application, it can use this service. Suppose this application, this pod want to access this pod, can it use this service internally in the code? Which means, does one pod, one microservice can communicate with other microservice within the cluster using service names? Again, within the cluster, do we need to have that service has node port? If within the cluster only I want to access? Not required. Cluster IP. If you want to access from outside also, then node port service. Now, let's come back to pod concept again. Let's come back to pod concept again. Let's come back to pod concept again. So, pod is always runs on the node. Pod is a group of one or more containers. We have different types of pods. Pod model types. Pod model types. So we have a single container pod, or also we can have a multi-container pods. Most often, most frequently, so Sarika Bharadwaj is asking, in real time pod communication will happen when they have a dependent on each other. If you understand microservices architecture, did you guys attended what, when I explained monolithic and microservice? Did you guys attended the session? So if it is a microservice architecture, are you going to have your applications deployed as multiple small application? Is one application needs to communicate with other application? If one application needs to communicate with other application, in Kubernetes you are deploying your microservices. Are you going to create a pods for those microservices? Let's say this is login service, this is registration service. Does this login service has to communicate with registration, checkout has to communicate with some other thing? So then how communication happen if you are deploying your microservices in Kubernetes as a pods? Do we need a service concept? Do you need a service concept? You are deploying your microservices as a Kubernetes pods. Let's say this is login, this is registration, this is checkout. Just to give an example, this is payments pods. this this application want to communicate with this one, this application want to communicate to this one, like this. Each service has to communicate, each application has to communicate with each other. Is it recommended to use IPs of these respective pods for API calls within these microservices? Is it recommended to use IPs of these pods for intercommunication? No. Why it is not recommended? Why it is not recommended? Pod IPs are keep on changing. Let's say I have lot of replicas. Let's say there is a lot of load on this checkout. Can I have multiple pods? Can I have multiple pods? Can I scale my pods? Instead of one replica, can I scale it to multiple replicas of the checkout microservice pods? In that case, do we need a load balancing also? So can I create a service? Can I use service name? If this application want to talk to this application, can we use service name? Service will discover your pods and it will do the load balancing. Whatever I am explaining here, this is also real time only. This is one microservice. This is one microservice. If this microservice want to access this microservice, what concept we are using? This is not a sample application. You can consider this also as a real time only. I am taking that use case. This is one application. This is one application. How this application is recommended to talk to this application? From last 2 days we were discussing. What concept we are using? Service. So this is also real time. This is, I'm taking that use case. I'm taking that use case. This is one microservice. This is one microservice. This is running as pod. This is also running as a pod. How this microservice can communicate with this microservice? Are we using services in the cluster? Yes. So same way. There is nothing called real time. I told 100 times, there is nothing called real time. Everything is a requirement, use case. This is one microservice. This is one microservice. You want this microservices to be accessed from this microservice. In Kubernetes, both are running as pods in the cluster. Do I need a service to be created? Can I use that service? The way I have showcased this one. The way I have showcased with this application, same way. Now, let's come back to this concept, pod model types. Pod model types. Most often, when we deploy a pod into Kubernetes cluster, most often, how many containers we will have in that pod? Most often, we will have only single container. Suppose you have like this, guys. Suppose you are deploying your application in a microservice architecture. You have a login related image. You have a registration related image. You have checkout related image, the Docker image, microservice. Are you going to deploy everything in a single pod with the 3 containers like this? Are you going to do like this? When you are saying multi-container pods or multi-container applications, are we going to create like this? All the 3 pod, single pod having all these 3 containers? No. Why? Why we will not have like this? Suppose if there is a change in the login image, I am trying to redeploy login image, but that pod has other 2 containers also. Will the pod will be deleted and recreated when I am redeploying? Yes. Pod will be deleted and recreated. Again, even though there is no change in this one, is this application also going to be deleted and recreated? Is those containers also will be stopped and recreated? Yes. So multi-container pods is not like this. The multi-container pods, which doesn't mean you are going to deploy all your images in a single pod. Most often, how many containers we will have in a pod? 1. Most often we will have 1 pod. What is the one more problem if I have like this? Let me tell you. Scaling. there is a lot of load in the login. I want to scale the login pod. I want to scale the login pod. Will I end up scaling other applications also? If I have like this, if I have single pod with all these containers, I want to scale only login related stuff. There is a lot of load on login. I want to scale the pods of login. Will I end up scaling other containers also? If I have like this, all the three in same pod. So this is not correct. This is not correct. But within this pod, let's say 2 containers are there. If there is a issue in this container, will it impact other container? I mean to say, this container is down. Will it impact other container? Is that container also goes down? No. Container will not go down. But this application, this container is trying to access something from other container in the same pod. Will it impact then? This container is trying to access something from other container. Then this container is down. So then this container also will get impacted. That's why what I am trying to say here, most often, most frequently, yesterday someone was asking in the chat, sir, can you take multi-container application scenario? We will have a multi-container applications, which doesn't mean all the containers will be part of same pod. It is not like that. It is not like this. Instead of like this, can I have a separate pods? Separate pods like login pod separately for that microservice. Login separate. This pod contains only that login related. I will create a container out of this image. Can I have another pod for this application, this microservice, where I will have only that container created out of this image. So this is most often you will see. Most often you will see like this only. Now, any change in the login microservice code, can I deploy only login related stuff without impacting this registration pods, checkout pods? If I have this way? Yes. Now, if there is a lot of load on login, can I scale only login pods? Which means instead of having one pod, can I have 2 pods, 4 pods, 5 pods for that login? Yes. So most often when we are deploying the pods, most often when you are deploying a pods, it contains what? Single container. But there are some instances. You might need to deploy pod with multiple containers. There are some advanced use cases, some advanced scenarios where you need to deploy pod with multiple containers. So there are 2 model types. There are 2 pod model types. One is single container pod. We call it as a one container pod or single container pod. So this model is most popular. This model is most popular. Pod is the wrapper of a single container. So since pod is the smallest object in Kubernetes that recognize, it will manage the pods instead of directly managing the containers. So if it is a single container pod, it will have only one container. Another type, multi-container pod, or we call it as a sidecar containers. Multi-container pod or sidecar container. Sometimes in the interview also they'll ask, what is sidecar container? Multi-container pod or sidecar containers. In this model, a pod can hold, which means a pod can have multiple co-located containers. Co-located containers. What does it mean? Suppose I create a pod with multiple containers. Does those 2 containers will be co-located, which means does those 2 containers will be running always on same node which belongs to that pod? Will it be running on same node? That can be any node, but will it be in same node? Both containers will be co-located. If I have a pod with 2 containers, does those 2 containers will be running in same node? That can be any node, but in same node, which means will their locating at the same location, same system? Yes. But here, what is that use case? What type of use cases we will go with sidecar? The name itself is saying sidecar. What is the meaning of sidecar? Or helper. We can call it as a helper. Sidecar or helper. What type of use case? Let me tell you. You go for this multi-container or sidecar container model. You will have a primary container, main application, main application, and utility container or helper container. Utility container or helper container that will help or enhance your application functionality. Utility container that helps or enhance how application functions. Now, let me tell you one use case. Is sidecar and init container both are same? No. Init containers are different. Sidecar is different. Init containers are different. Sidecar containers are different in Kubernetes. So, this is a sidecar, basically a primary container and helper container. Let me take one use case. I have one application. Let's say I have one application. That application has to read some file. This application code. I have some application which is running. I am running this as a container. Now this has to read some file. That file is not part of this container file system. That file is somewhere out. Maybe somewhere outside of that. Maybe this might be in one NFS, or that file might be in FTP location. That file might be in some FTP location. So this application has to read this file. This application code has to read this file. Then this application has to write that file to the database. Let's say you have a database. The database may be running as a container, or the database might be running as a pod in the cluster, or it is running as a server. That doesn't matter. It has to read this file from outside of that, and it has to write that, process that file and write into the database. This is my functionality. I have a functionality, the requirement for a developer, that file is outside of my system. It has to read that file and process that file and insert the file into database, let's say. Now, instead of writing everything in a single application, single code, like getting this file inside this container and again reading and writing that file to the database, instead of writing everything as a single code, can I break this into two pieces? As a developer, here I am talking about. As a developer, can I break this into two pieces? Instead of tightly coupling all the logic in same container, same code, can I break this into two pieces? One is one process will just get the file from FTP, from outside. Another process, another code, another process just read the file and insert into DB. Can I break this into two different applications as a developer? Now, this application, it will just get the file from outside and keep it here. Can I call this as a helper or sidecar? It is helping the main application. Can I call this application, this process as a helper to this application, this process? Helper, sidecar. So can I create a container? Can I write a code that will only get the file? That will only get the file from outside. That I will have one container, this one, this container. So this container will only get the file from outside and make it available to one more application, one more container. As I already told, what is common for both the containers, guys? What is common for both the containers or all the containers which is running in this pod? Is volumes also common? Is volumes also common? Storage is common for both the containers which is running in that pod? Yes. So in this process, can this process get the file and keep it in that volume which is attached to this one? This process, this container, I can call it as a helper container or sidecar container. Can I have a code which will get the file from this location and keep it available to another container in this volume which is attached to that pod? Can I call this as a helper or sidecar which is helping this actual application, actual container? Yes. Then this actual container, the main container, pod, main container, instead of reading this main container, instead of reading the file from outside, can it use the file which is already available in this volume? This main container, the actual container, can it read the file which is already available in this volume attached to that pod? Can it insert into the database? So this way, can I have sidecar container? This is going to help the actual container. Now, one more advantage here. Tomorrow, the file is not in FTP. Tomorrow, the file is not in FTP. The tomorrow file is there in S3. Let's say S3 bucket. Now, do I need to modify this main container logic, main code, the actual main logic? Do I need to modify? Tomorrow file is there in S3 instead of FTP. Now, I no need to worry about this main logic. Can I just modify this helper container code, that helper container logic, instead of reading from FTP? Can I update the code which can get the file from S3 also? Without worrying about from where it is getting, this helper container will get the file from S3 and keep it available in this volume. Does this main container will continue to work? So with this, can I decouple my application logic also? Can I decouple my application logic also by writing kind of a helper code? I can run that helper container as a sidecar container and the actual main container. So can I use this sidecar containers or helper containers to enhance how application can function? Example of sidecar containers like a shippers, log shippers, watchers, or proxy agents, monitoring agents. Can I have all these things as a sidecar containers? Like this? Yes. So what is common for all the containers which is running in same pod? Whatever example I have explained, that is here. What is common for all the containers which are running in same pod? Storage is common. Storage, volume, which means whatever volume I attach to this pod, can I mount that volume from all the containers in that pod? Can I mount those values from all the containers from that pod if required? Yes. And also network. Network is also common. What is the meaning of network? Suppose I have two containers in the same pod. Again, is this possible, guys? Can I have multiple containers running on same container port in single pod? Is it possible? Can I have multiple containers running in same pod and container port is same? Is it possible like this? No, it is not possible. Can I have multiple containers in same pod with same container port, which means can I have two Tomcat containers are running on 8080 in same pod? No. It should be unique. Something like this. Just to give an example, something like this. Both are running in same pod. How this container can communicate with this container? Within the pod, how one container can communicate with other container? Do I need a service? Do I need a pod IP? Do I need a service required? Within this pod, one container want to communicate with other container. Do I really need a service within the pod? If one pod want to communicate with other pod, if one pod want to communicate with other pod, service. The container in one pod want to communicate with container in another pod, we need a service. But here my question is, within the pod I have two containers. Within the pod I have two containers. This container want to communicate with this container, some network call, API call like that. Do I need a pod IP? Do I need to use pod IP service like that? Not required. Since both are sharing same network space, the containers which is running in the pod will share same network space. So does containers can communicate with each other within the pod using local host like this? This container want to communicate with this container. Can they use local host on 3000? The port of that other container, can they use like this if the other container is running on 3000? Yes. If this container want to communicate with this one, can they use localhost 3001? If this container want to communicate with this one, can they use localhost 3001? Yes. All these questions will come in the interview. Very, very important. How containers in same pod can communicate with each other? What is the answer for that? Since all the containers which is running in same pod will share the same network space, can they use localhost? Using localhost. But this pod want to communicate with this pod, let's say. This is different pod, this is different pod. We can use pod IPs, but is it recommended again? No. Pod IPs are not recommended. Then can we use service? Can we create a service within the cluster, service of type cluster IP? Then can we access using service? Yes. This is how it works. So as I already told, are we going to have multiple containers in every pod, whatever we are going to have, or based on your requirement? If you want to enhance your main functionality, are you going to have sidecar approach? Based on the requirement only, you will have a sidecar. Is everyone clear? What is pod? What is single container pod? What is multi-container pod or sidecar container? And what is service? Now, we will first understand pod lifecycle. Pod lifecycle. Again, whenever we are making request to API server, whenever we are making a pod request to API server using pod manifest file, what API server is doing, as I already told, is API server is validating the request, and if everything is fine, is it storing in the etcd? Yes. Then scheduler comes. The scheduler will find unscheduled pods and it will schedule the nodes for that pods. Will it assign the nodes for that pods? Yes. Then the kubelet which is running on that node, sees that the pod is scheduled and will it fire the commands. In the document I have given Docker commands, but as of now, is it a Docker or containerd? Containerd. So does that kubelet will fire containerd commands to pull the image and create a container? Does that kubelet will fire containerd commands to pull the image and create a container? Yes. Now, if I am using Docker, then does kubelet will fire Docker commands? If I am using Docker as a runtime? Yes. The entire life cycle of this pod be stored where? the entire life cycle of that pod in the etcd. Now, the pod is ephemeral. Pod is ephemeral, which means pod will live for very short time. Pod is ephemeral, lasting for very short time. So if I am directly creating a pod, if pod is down for some reason, am I going to get another pod automatically? If I am directly creating a pod, if something is wrong with pod is down, am I going to get another pod automatically? No. And also, if I am directly using pods, will I able to scale the pods? Which means I have only one replica, one pod. Will I able to scale to 2 pods, 3 pods if I am directly using pods? No. If you see, this is my pod. This is my pod. I am intentionally deleting the pod, but this can happen for any reason. I intentionally deleted a pod. Now, am I going to get that pod automatically? If you see, am I getting that pod automatically? No. So, is my application accessible now? That application? No. So, pods will live for very short time. If pods go down, pods goes down, you will not get the pod automatically. And also, what is one more problem? As I told, now I have only one pod. Will I able to scale this pod to 2 replicas, 3 replicas? I mean to say 2 pods, 3 pods if I am directly dealing with pods? No. So that's why in Kubernetes, you should not directly create or use pod. In Kubernetes, you have a controllers. That controllers like a replication controller, replica set, daemon set, deployment, stateful set. Like this, you have a controllers. So it is not recommended to directly create a pods. You should not create a pods directly for deploying your applications. Kubernetes have a controllers like this. So using these controllers, if I create a pods, does these controllers will make sure the pods are running? That pods are running. These controllers will make sure these pods are always running, these controllers. And will I able to scale the will I able to scale the pods, whatever is created using these controllers? Can I scale my deployment? Can I scale my replica set? Can I scale my replication controller? Yes. So that's why it is not recommended to create a pods directly. But without knowing what is pod, if I directly explain what is a replica set, what is deployment, you can't understand. So we discussed what is pod, what is container, what is single container pod, what is multi-container pod. Then only we are starting with these controllers. So is everyone clear? Are we going to deploy pods directly the way we deployed last 2 days? No. We are going to use controllers. That I will continue in the next class, guys. So next class is on Monday. So this Saturday, you can utilize and practice whatever is pending. Tomorrow, no class. Next Saturday, I am taking a class. Tomorrow, no class. Try to practice whatever is pending tomorrow and after tomorrow. Guys, practice is very, very important. Even though I explain this much in depth, I am explaining, unless until you put the effort, unless until you practice, that is of no use. You will have a lot of confusions, lot of doubts. I am going very depth. To be frank, I am going very depth. This much is not required. But I am going very depth. That will benefit in the long term. For you. You can crack any interview. You can manage your work without any proxy, any support, but you need to put the same effort. Whatever effort I am putting, Same effort I need from you also. Then only it will be benefit for you. Janardhan, all the use cases will be covered. Each time we are giving namespace in the comments. Is there a way to modify? Yes. All the use cases I will cover. We have another 20 classes for Kubernetes. How to deploy applications without bringing my application down. Someone was asking, sir, will it impact my production live environment? I am trying to do some modification. We will discuss all these things. No need to worry, guys. 20 days is there still. We'll discuss in the further classes all these use cases. But basics are important. Without knowing what is what is pod, what is kubelet, what is kubedium, without knowing the understanding of architecture, what is happening. If you know only those things, that won't help. So I am I am explaining basics first. Then we are going for advanced concepts. Thank you, guys. I'll continue on Monday. Have a great weekend. And